Welcome, friends. We'll get started momentarily. Hello, hello. If someone from the audience could let me know they see my screen and hear my voice, that's always helpful. And you will see in the chat box that I put a link for tonight's library announcements and links to our presenters. And this is a living document that we'll keep up with as our presenters speak to and add any resources that they talk about to this document. Okay, I'm assuming you can all, yay, thank you. I'm now definitely assuming you can all see and hear me because you have spoken. All right, we're gonna get started with library announcements. So as I mentioned, thank you for being here this evening. We are, one, celebrating AAPI Heritage Month and coming to a close of that celebration, but not a close of honoring AAPI creators, authors, writers, poets. We celebrate AAPI creators all year round with a special highlight in May. This is also part of San Francisco Public Library's On the Same Page literary campaign, where we encourage all of San Francisco to read the same book. This is generally a bi-monthly campaign. So Vanessa's book will be celebrated and honored from May to June, but we also have a special June, also it's an odd special June celebration, which the book cover is hard to see. 100 Boyfriends in June. Brontez Purnell's book will be a June special edition Pride on the Same Page. And don't miss Brontez and Alvin Orloff in combo on June 1st. And pick up the book now at your library. All right, library announcements. Welcome to the unceded land of the Ohlone tribal people. We want to acknowledge the many Ramaytush Ohlone tribal groups and families as the rightful stewards in the lands on which we reside. Our library is committed to uplifting the name of these lands and community members from these nations with whom we live together. The library encourages you to learn more about first-person culture and land rights and are committed to hosting events and providing educational resources on these topics. And you can find that in that link that I placed in the chat box. SFPL is not a neutral institution and stands in solidarity with our Asian community and our Black community. And we condemn all of the horrendous violence against Asian. There we go. We condemn the horrendous violence against Asian and Asian Americans in our community, state, nationwide, both the reported and invisible crimes. The library stands in solidarity with our Asian communities, neighbors, and colleagues distressed and hurt by these attacks. We acknowledge that these events are complicated by the entanglement of anti-Black and anti-Asian stereotypes, and that anti-Asian and anti-Black racism both uphold white supremacy, and we are all harmed by these structures. The library stands for Libraries for All, and we all have a stake in dismantling white supremacy for a true multiracial democracy. And we love this quote by Grace Lee Boggs, activist. Libraries are trickling open. We have 3 open at the moment for browse and bounce, and many open for curbside pickup, and many more to come soon. Please continue to wear your mask when you come visit us. Tomorrow, if you don't follow Chinatown Pretty on Instagram, do so now. The best and most wise and stylish seniors ever across 6 Chinatowns across America. And they will, Valerie and Andrea will be here tomorrow to talk about their book and their Instagram fame. And a couple more programs celebrating AAPI, The Romance of Chinese Poetry, featuring Clara Hu and Gu Guin master David Wong. And if you don't know Clara, she is everywhere. She is a poet of all poets. She even has a rap out there, which I'm gonna put it in the chat box later because it's just so amazing and cute. This Wednesday, our poet laureate, Tango Eisen Martin, brings us Poets from Mississippi. So sort of silver linings of shelter in place is we get to host all these people from all over the world and all over our own country. So join us for that. And then we're stepping straight into summer stride. I can't believe it. It's insane that we are there. But June, July, and August, we have so much planned for you, including this amazing event, also brought to us through Tongo. And we're celebrating Marlon Peterson's book, Bird Uncaged, an abolitionist freedom song. And Marlon will be in conversation with Kisi Lemon, who has a book called Heavy, and his new book, Long Division, has just been republished. Both of those books are superb. Bird Uncaged was, I could not put it down. I've been wanting to get Kisi Lemon in our library for so long, so I'm really excited about this one. So please come and show some support for these three authors that we have. As I mentioned, Summer Stride is here. It's time, sign up, get your reading in, get your iconic Summer Stride tote bag. It's gonna have that adorable SF Libraries, Love Libraries imagery on it. Do your reading, come to all of our events, and I'm gonna breeze through to this. So as I mentioned, this is part of our On the Same Page campaign, and we are honored to have and celebrate Vanessa Hua. I have been doing this job at the library for 2.5 years, I think, and from day one, Vanessa has been popping up at library events in my email, and she not only shows support for our library, but support for all the authors and all the writers out there, and is always championing for other writers. So we love that about Vanessa, and her book, A River of Stars, has been nominated twice for an On the Same Page, and now it has come up again and finally got through. What was also nominated on the shortlist for a One City, One Book campaign. That year, There by Tommy Orange was selected. Vanessa is an award-winning bestseller author and columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle. Her novel, A River of Stars, was named to the Washington Post and NPR's Best Books of 2018 list, and has been called a marvel by the Oprah magazine, and delightful by The Economist. Her short story, Deceit and Other Possibilities, a New York Times editor choicer, received an Asian Pacific American Award in Literature and was a finalist for the California Book Award and New American Voices Award. Her forthcoming novel, Forbidden City, will be published in spring 2022. And you can get River of Stars and Deceit and Other Possibilities at our library or your favorite local bookstore. Tonight, Vanessa is in conversation with Yalitza Ferreras, who is the recipient of a 2020 Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award and recent Steinbeck Fellow at San Jose State University. Her writing has appeared in Best American Short Stories 2016, Kenyon Review, Bellevue Library Review, Asterix, and Southern Review, Colorado Review, and elsewhere. Yalitza received an MFA in creative writing from the University of Michigan. All right, friends, let's turn it over to our authors tonight.
Thank you so much, Anissa. That was a wonderful introduction, and I'm so grateful to SF Public Library. I miss the physical space dearly, but I swear I'm checking an ebook out for myself or my kids almost like every other day. And thanks to all of you who are joining tonight. And I'm very excited to be in conversation with Yalitza, one of my very best writing friends, no qualifiers. So.
Hi, Vanessa.
Hi.
Hi, everyone at home. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be discussing and in conversation about A River of Stars, Vanessa Hua's thrilling ride of a novel. I thought we would get started with Vanessa, if you could give us a little taste of your amazing prose before we just talk.
I'll read from the opening, and Yalitza has I saw this draft in manuscript form and was in fact sitting across from me many times writing together at the Writers' Grotto. So it feels very special to be reading this aloud. So A River of Stars. When boss Yeung first told her about Perfume Bay, she'd tossed the brochure onto the dashboard and reached for a slice of dried mango. Shaking his head, he took the bag, but before he could stop her, she snatched a slice of chewy sweetness. During her pregnancy, he'd begun scrutinizing her, prescribing advice, some backed by science, but most by superstition, to protect the baby. She shouldn't eat mangoes, as their heat would give the baby bad skin. No watermelon, whose chill would cool her womb. No bananas, which would cause the baby to slip out. No water chestnuts, mung beans, or bean sprouts either. The list of traditional prohibitions grew each time she attempted to eat. As he drifted into the next lane, she told him to keep his eyes on the road. He gripped the steering wheel and told her his plan. He wanted to send her and their unborn child halfway around the world to Perfume Bay, 5-star accommodations located outside of Los Angeles. After she delivered, staff would file for a social security card, birth certificate, and passport for their baby. Their son, his sex recently confirmed, would give them a foothold in America. Eventually, he could sponsor our green cards, Scarlett had said. For now, you'll get rid of me. Clever plan, Boss Yeung. At the factory, she called him Boss Yeung, and she kept it up in private too, a reminder that she was a deputy manager and not a xiaojie, a mistress, a gold digger from a disco or a hostess bar. Boss Yeung reached into the glove box for a brand new US Atlas that he must have hand carried from Hong Kong. Hope unfurled in her chest. She always navigated on their weekend drives, and with this gift, she pictured them traveling across America together. Whatever hospital you'd deliver in would be top class, he said. The hospitals are good in Hong Kong too, she said. Boss Yeung frowned. Hong Kong was also home to his wife and 3 daughters. So that's from the opening, and I'll leave from there. And let's say what starts off as complicated gets more complicated.
It gets a lot more complicated. Thank you so much. I love that section, and that is, as Vanessa, as you mentioned, that was in one of the early drafts that I read, and what strikes me about what you read is that there's all these rules imposed on women, and especially like pregnant women and like traditional cultures, and but this book is so full of very strong characters and women who just defy all of the restrictions that are put on them. And when I first read your book, I was like, oh my God, this is like pregnant Thelma and Louise. Yes, this is the best premise for a book. Like, it's so exciting. You don't read a lot about pregnant women on the run and doing all kinds of crazy things. Yeah, so I guess I read early drafts, and there were so many wonderful things in the book that I felt like didn't make it into the final version. And I was wondering if is there anything that you wish you had kept, or like something that like really just like when when you had, the novel's been out like a couple of years now, but is there still something that you're like, oh my God, I wish I could have held on to that, and for whatever reason, the editing process can be so fraught. But yeah, is there anything that?
Well, it's interesting, and I think and I don't know how many writers are logged on tonight, but the path to every book is not like an arrow shooting straight to the finishing line or straight to the target. I think sometimes people will ask, well, how long did it take you to write the book? And I'll say, well, I first started getting the idea for it when I was pregnant with my twin sons, who are turning 10 this year. And I was living in Southern California, and that's when I began hearing about these maternity tourism centers. I'll get to your question, but I just want to kind of explain. And then just, the neighbors were baffled. They were wondering why these pregnant Chinese women were showing up in their cul-de-sacs, why the garbage can was overflowing with diapers. it was like a brothel in reverse. And it, you know, it was intriguing to discover that they were, as my narrator Scarlett, were coming here a month or two so that they could give birth and their children would get US citizenship. So in terms of the novel, how it initially began, every chapter had a different narrator. I was imagining something like Jennifer Egan's Goon Squad. And I knew it was a risk because sometimes, I mean, I think the question, you know, was Goon Squad actually a novel or was it a short story collection? Or, you know, is that up for someone else to decide? So portions of this novel, it was always Scarlett's story, but there were different points of view, say from Daisy's point of view, from Daisy's boyfriend. And actually, and it was funny, I think later I was looking at a review and a reader said, oh, I wish we got more of Daisy. And I was like, you know, so do I. But in a way, going back to the birth metaphors, I think there were portions of those sections that ended up still in the book. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Vanishing Twin. Yes, it sounds cannibalistic, but basically, when twins are sometimes in utero, it starts off as twins, but then a portion kind of ends up only one baby, you know, so one of them sort of vanishes inside the other. So I think in that same way, I think things that I, you know, there wasn't room for in the book, still, you know, perspectives, let's say, still ended up in the book, but told through Scarlett's eyes. And then also, some of the chapters actually did end up in Disney and Other Possibilities. So there was a Kingsway, there was a subplot involving the boyfriend that ended up in my short story collection instead. Or Old Woo, our beloved Chinatown bachelor, in the novel, it's his sort of like, it's referenced that he goes off to China and comes back with the bride. And so in the short story collection, we actually, that's where we get to see his adventures. So if you are kind of curious for, I don't want to call them outtakes or even B-sides, but they are, some of that universe exists in my short story collection.
Yeah, no, your stories are certainly not outtakes. They're pretty amazing. And yeah, since we're talking about your stories, like, so how do you, when you started working on A River of Stars, did it start out as a story, or was it like this collection of stories, some of which ended up in the story collection, or like what made you stick with it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I remember kind of going back, as I said, I wrote it sort of in the aftermath of giving birth, and it's sort of like sleepless nights, mind erasure, can't really remember. But then Gmail had, Gmail like spelled out like what it was. But basically about 9 months after giving birth was when I turned in my first short story based, it was basically the scene all the way up until she hijacks the van at the maternity at the hospital. And so that was my, you know, in a way it's sort of like, I had been trying to write after giving birth, but I like the symmetry of like, it took me 9 months to grow my babies. And then it took me sort of another 9 months to sort of like be able to ramp up again, and, you know, be able to write a short story that was like whole and complete. And then I was working on other projects, but something about the characters kept tugging at me. And I don't think every short story, that I don't feel that way about every short story. But with this one, I definitely, and you know, it actually even got published in Ziziva, which is another wonderful local Bay Area, West Coast magazine, and who's been a huge supporter of my work. And so it ran as a short story in there, but yet I still felt like I'm just going to keep going and see what that feels like. And I think it is hard. I think in some ways, and my novel that's coming out next year, Forbidden City, also began as a short story. And I think it has more to do with, and we can talk about the difference between short stories and novels, you know, besides length, but I think it would be too hard for me to be like, I'm going to sit down today and start a 300-page project that will take years of my life. I think it's easier for me to think like, okay, I have this premise in mind. I have this character. I'm going to see how far I can toss the ball for the next like 15, 20 pages. Like I can manage that. That seems like something I can get my head around. Although I will say this, and you actually also read an early draft of this. I have a novella coming out next month on Audible, and that was 40 pages, which I guess is a shorter novella, but it was like kind of interesting to be like, okay, again, it was in terms of just thinking about different forms. Like, did I know I was going to sit down and be like, I'm going to write something extra long, or I think the story eventually finds the form it's supposed to take.
Yeah, and I know you've been asked about this before. This is what happens when you're really good at more than one thing. So you're an award-winning journalist as well as award-winning fiction writer. So yeah, how do you? I know your journalism career informs your fiction, and how do you navigate that? And actually, this is a slightly selfish question. I guess what I want to know is like, how do those two sides of your work, like how do they influence each other in terms of the like actual work, like as you're working? Like, are there sort of things you or processes that you use in journalism that you use in fiction and vice versa?
Okay. Yeah, great question. I think for me, at the heart of it, I want to shine a light onto untold stories. That's something I do in my fiction and nonfiction. And I'm also just a very curious person. And I'm like, I just want to know what people's stories are. And as a journalist, I felt so honored when I've had those moments when people do feel safe and comfortable letting me help them tell their story. And I think the storytelling comes from the fact that I'm the American-born daughter of Chinese immigrants. And I think from early on, I could understand that the world inside my house was very different than the world outside of it, and just trying to make sense of that, whether that was through observation or through going to the library and reading lots of books, or also just again as a journalist realizing that I could go out in the world and wonder aloud, like, why is that, and then kind of follow that thread. So in terms of how both inform each other, there's a couple things that come to mind. I think I love doing both. My weekly column, I just filed that for this Friday. I love how it gets me out in the world, engaged with other people in the community, other readers. Like I've curated reader poetry for National Poetry Month. All of that has been so deeply meaningful and amazing. And I'm so grateful for that relationship because it sort of gets me out in the world. And whereas a novel is like a years long process, and there's lots of dead ends and wrong turns, and you just sort of could get stifled if that was like the only thing. For me, I feel like it would have been just like too much in my head. And I think as my journalism training has helped my novel, my book writing, because I have the discipline of sort of knowing the first draft is not the last draft. So it doesn't have to be perfect. I just have to push through and, just writing daily, and also being open to being edited. I mean, words matter. I will sort of fight over a comma if I think it's important, but also just not being too precious about things, just being open to feedback and suggestions. And I think for my journalism, definitely I gained if I look at my early journalism stories, like from college, it almost reads like a court transcript. It's just like quote, 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 last quote, instead of really looking for narrative movement and just like, how do we open this? How do we circle back so it's in a satisfying way? How do we make this person's character come alive on the page? So I think in those ways, both practices nourish one another. But I also will say this, sometimes people ask like, oh, how do you do all this? I don't have Hermione's time turner, unfortunately, so I can't do three things in 1 hour. But I'll do things like, I've compared this to sort of almost domestic thrift. Like you bake a chicken one day, the next day you strip it down and make it into sandwiches or whatever. And the third day you boil it down for stock. And so in that same way, I remember there's all this stuff about China postpartum birth practices in A River of Stars. And so I was curious about it, and I went and I looked up scientific papers, and then I went to the South Bay where I interviewed women who were doing this, listened to this presentation, and I did a sort of braided narrative essay of that plus the research, and then some of that research then ended up in the novel. So, and it's stuff I was curious about anyway. So I don't know, it's sort of like, I've sort of joke like, can you write life off as a business expense? I think as a journalist or a fiction writer, you are always sort of like going out in the world and figuring out, yes, on one hand, you're engaged with the world but then there is this possibility of sort of transforming it in your work.
Oh my God, the chicken thing was brilliant. I'm gonna try to remember that as I work on like not as many things as you're working on. But I wanted to talk a little bit about, so you mentioned, being a first generation American, you're Chinese American, I'm Dominican American, and telling, the stories, knowing that like things at home are not necessarily the way that things are outside. And I read, you had an article on KQED about Amy Tan, and her PBS is doing a documentary on Amy Tan. So you wrote about that, and you wrote about how when you were young, a few years before she published the Joy Luck Club, you read her story Fish Cheeks in 17 magazine, and that it was the first time you had read a short story about a Chinese American teenager. And so, we know that representation matters, and, the way, in the same way that Amy Tan influenced you, you are now influencing other writers, and emerging writers. And so I know that for me, like, as like a writer of color, I feel like, I don't want to feel like I should tell only one kind of story, there's multitudes. And what I love about A River of Stars is that it's a highly original and propulsive, moving really fast story with these Chinese characters that are, especially the main characters, Scarlett and then Daisy, these very strong-willed women. And so how do you, is there any advice or anything to say to like emerging writers of color that sort of, how do you navigate that feeling that, we have to tell one kind of story?
Well, and I will say this, and it's just been so exciting to see this flourishing by BIPOC writers, Asian American, Latinx, Native, Indigenous, like Black. I feel like it's been time, and it's been very exciting to kind of see it starting to happen. But in terms of just, I think there was a time where in college where I thought, well, I knew I'd wanted to be a writer ever since I was a kid, but I had thought like, I think for a time I was writing sort of like terrible Anne Beatty knockoff stories where it was the characters, it was like in New York, and, the characters were all white because I thought, well, that's what literature with a capital L is, stories about white people. So, but then after I began getting exposed to writers from various diasporas, in college, or, as I, the syllabus beyond sort of like K through 12 of the early 90s, I began realizing like the strength in that and the power in that, and really wanting in my fiction and in my journalism to tell the story that only I could tell and only the way I could tell it. just understanding that there was value in being able to see the world in a specific way that was informed by my culture, by my family, by, you know, who I am. And that's why I feel so grateful. I mean, and I'm not going to say it was easy. There were times where you have to sort of like almost take everything at like 2 or 3 steps back to explain, like, why is this a story? Why are we human? All that. So, but I think, again, that's why you realize, you know, people like Maxine Hong Kingston or Amy Tan, people, they opened the way so that people could come after them. And then my hope, yes, is to then further help open the way for other people who have been coming up.
That's great. And I think that because so I read another article this past week that was in the New York Times about just about publishing, and I think it was, I don't remember what it was called. It was called like How White is Publishing or something like that. And what the authors did was they tried to sort of quantify, you know, how many writers of color are actually publishing, and they worked with 2 numbers. They I think it was from 1950 to 2018. They added up those numbers, and then they also just did 2018 alone. So for the first number, it was 95% white, and then in 2018, it was, I believe, about 90% white. So there's a little bit of progress, but certainly not enough. And I think that people's perceptions get skewed because a lot of writers of color have won major awards, and it's
Recently,
yes.
recently,
you know, the Pulitzer and National Book Awards and lots of awards, and so it feels like there's a lot of us out there, but there aren't. Is there anything like that can help, that is there anything that like readers can do to like help writers of color, like besides buying their books?
That's a great question. And I think, and you know, something that I mean, we could talk all day about sort of like the publishing industry and just sort of what direction it's headed in, and you know, but I think just very tangibly, aside from like getting the book, reading it with your book club, requesting it at your local library for purchase. One thing I always say is buy local from your local bookstore, but review it on Amazon. Because amazingly, even if it's just one line or one sentence, that makes a huge difference. Because I think sort of in the aggregate, things like Amazon or Goodreads, it's, for better or for worse, like how many reviews an author has does become sort of like a mark for some buyers. And so I always make it a point for my friends, you know, emerging writers or established ones too, to, as soon as I finish the book, that I review it on one of these sites, because I think, again, there's so many ways in which you understand that publishing dollars or marketing dollars maybe go towards only a few titles, or, you know, frankly, for the celebrity authors who are people who, you know, how do you get a bestseller? Be a celebrity. So things like that Amazon review, that one sentence Amazon review can make a difference.
Yeah, and also requesting the book from your local library.
Yes, definitely.
Making sure that those books are carried so that, you know, lots of other readers are, you know, are influenced by writers of color.
Yes, definitely.
One
of my favorite things is, I think I looked at the SF Public Library page, and it was like, for our event page, it was like, if you like this book, you may like these. I just love, I don't know, it feels like the books are in conversation with each other in the same way that authors are in conversations with each other. And it's just, I love looking at your shelfie and just being able to see just more than one book by a BIPOC author, you know, on a and a whole row is like just the best feeling.
Yeah, and I mean, librarians are awesome, and you just want to, you know, be in their conversations, and you know, be recommended by them. It's like, so it would be such an honor.
Yes.
And the library makes an appearance in A River of Stars when Daisy, she's studying for the GRE, I believe it is.
Or she's studying for the SAT.
For the SAT, right. Yeah, so I thought that was great. I was like, yeah, library.
And actually, I'm working on my next book, and the opening chapter involves a scene at the library. So come to me for library content in my fiction.
I have a feeling you'll be doing another one of these conversations with the library, especially with that book. Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about, and I believe that was the Chinatown library. I wanted to ask you about Chinatown and San Francisco Chinatown in your book. So a lot of the story takes place in California. There's some scenes like backstory in China, but most of the story takes place in California, a little bit in LA, but mostly the Bay Area. And I feel like this book's very much like a love letter to the Bay Area. I love your descriptions of San Francisco. One of the things that I think you capture really well is just the scene, the late night scene of like tumbling out of a bar and, you know, going to a food cart. I skimmed the book before our event, and that was especially poignant right now because it's like, you know, we've all been locked in, and I was like, oh my God, this is so beautifully described. I feel like I'm back there for better or for worse. Yeah, so I loved just this whole world in Chinatown. You know, when immigrants like are in another country, they often like clump together and you know, in order to like, you know, make a way. And I think and like as there's one scene where Mama Fang she ends up in Cupertino. There's a Chinese community in Cupertino, and going to the Chinatown there, and you say that, you know, when you describe that, it's got all, you know, the food and the markets and the music that are like common to like all the Chinatowns around the world. And I loved what you said, that it was an attempt to remake, remember, and reclaim. So you know, in the book, Chinatown, San Francisco's Chinatown serves very much as a sanctuary, although it's complicated. And not everyone is welcoming. And you certainly capture those nuances in the book. How did that part of the story evolve? I just, yeah, like, did you set out to write a story that was so centered in San Francisco's Chinatown, or did it, like, how did it come about?
Yeah, and thanks again for reading so deeply into my work. And I too miss a bacon wrapped hot dog after a long night of drinks. So it's interesting. I think when it was the short story, it ended with her fleeing the hospital in LA. And so at that point, I had no idea where she'd end up. But in some ways, it made sense for her to hide out, to find a haven in San Francisco's Chinatown, which is the oldest in North America. And, you know, whenever I would do book talks, like I'd ask, like, who's been to Chinatown? And it's like a big tourist attraction. But, you know, and as a kid growing up, that's where we'd go for dim sum or groceries. But as a journalist, I began to gain access to what's up on the second floor, the third floor, the fourth floor, where you see the laundry hanging, and you realize it's this whole other world. You know, SROs that were originally designed as sort of bachelor apartments because of the Chinese Exclusion Act that really wasn't, you know, kept many families out for like over, you know, 6 decades. But now, because of the way things are, like that's where, available housing was. And I remember walking through and the doors were open because, the rooms are so small, but like kids sort of running around and sort of everyone in each other's business. And it's like a small town. And there's comfort in that. But then yet talking to a woman who said she was from Southern China, and she said, yeah, my apartment was nicer in China, but we're here for the opportunities. And so I think it made sense for the character to kind of try to find her way there, and to navigate that, and to also, I'm just, there's just such an energy to Chinatown, all those grannies with their elbows, and don't get in the way of them at the market. And yet it's a place where I think there's services, or these family community centers so there's this like sense of tradition. And so it's a very special place. And, I hadn't gone for a while during the pandemic, but then we went sometime around Chinese New Year, and like there were, streets were closed off for, firecrackers, and we went to the new playground, which is fabulous. And it just really cheered me up and my whole family to feel like we could support this neighborhood, but to kind of see that it had, endured.
Yeah, that's great. And but so the novel that you're working on now, or I don't know if you've handed it in, or it's newly baked.
It's my editor said she's looking through it. It's about to go to production, which means it's about to get copy edited. So it's slated for April 2022, but it's moving down the track.
Okay, so you're like in labor.
Yes, it's crowning.
Sorry, I had to, this book is very much about mothers, and I just need the connection there. But that one is set mostly in China.
Yes, but it does sort of begin and end in Oakland, or in San Francisco, Chinatown as well.
Right, great, okay. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? Because I think so. We're going to go into questions in a little while. I'm not sure if Vanessa mentioned that, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about it, and we can see, and people can
definitely. So, I'd love to share about Forbidden City, because it's sort of been on my mind because I'm sort of been deep in it. So interesting fact, Forbidden City, it will be my third book to be published, but it was actually the first book I wrote. So I wrote it in grad school, but 07, 08, 09. And at the time, and this will be interesting, I think, for those of you who are sort of interested in publishing, or maybe just interested in the backstory of books. And at the time, I had two other friends with books about to go out on submission, and that's what they call it, going out on submission. And they mentioned, oh, this is actually the third book I wrote. And I remember thinking, hope that's not going to happen to me. And so lo and behold, their books did sell. Mine came close, but did not. And as I say, close only matters in horseshoes and hand grenades. And so I was heartbroken, but all I could do was sort of put it away, and work on other books, work on Deceit and Other Possibilities, work on A River of Stars. But, I kept feeling, and that might have been the end of it. I remember talking to an editor and said, because, you feel like an imposter, like you feel like, why didn't this book sell? She's like, oh, everyone has a book in a drawer. And I'm like, easy for her to say. And so, but I kept returning to it. And when A River of Stars sold, they were able, my wonderful agents were able to sell Forbidden City on the strength of its first 50 pages. And I also have completely rewritten it. It's a very different book from what it was in 2009. I kind of needed to realize who the narrator was talking to. And that changed everything. And I think maybe in general, like thinking about audience, not in terms of the reader, but like in the world of the character, who are they addressing is like a really important question. I couldn't believe. But anyway, so to tell you what the story is actually about, what happened was maybe even longer ago, maybe 15 years ago, I was watching a documentary about, modern Chinese history, and suddenly on screen flashes a picture of Chairman Mao surrounded by what looked like, young Chinese women dressed like bobby soxers, checkered shirts, little flared skirts, and I was just astonished. And I looked into it, and turned out Chairman Mao was a fan of ballroom dancing and of young women. And when some of you may have read Chairman Mao's Doctor, he wrote a memoir, and in his memoir, he kind of says, like, for these women, it was the highest honor of their lives. And that was sort of like the end of how he believed it was for them. But I knew it had to be more complicated than that. So Forbidden City is set during the eve of the Cultural Revolution, and kind of imagines how one of these women might well have shaped the course of China and of this youth campaign.
So I feel really lucky that I've read a version of it, and it's absolutely enthralling and just so interesting to get this sort of imagined backstory of these women in this time. Do we have time? Can you read like a little snippet of it? Because it's really, really just beautiful and compelling.
Oh, sure. Okay, I'll read the first page from the opening chapter. Okay. Forbidden City. At dawn on the day of my departure, Ma filled our wooden tub with hot water. She hadn't bathed me in years and wouldn't have done so again until my wedding day. She squatted behind me and poured ladles of water over my head, the scent of dust and sweat rising off in the steam. The drops trickled down my nape, my shoulders, my chest, every part of me cherished. I leaned into her hands. Her breathing became ragged, and I felt her trembling through my body until we were both shaking. Little May, she murmured. When I tried to turn around, she gripped my shoulders. The water in the tub had gone lukewarm, and I shivered, the hairs raised on the back of my neck and arms. Ma? I asked. She didn't answer. She dried me in circling strokes, her hands slowed as if to delay our parting. It was the tenderness I'd always craved from her. Though she must have heard the fear in my voice, she couldn't face me. Not then, maybe not ever again. She would no longer warn me about fox fairies, shapeshifters who roamed the twilight to lure travelers, of disappeared girls, runaway or raped, kidnapped or killed. She knew that she had no choice but to give me up, I can now see, and didn't want me thinking about the dangers ahead. In that moment, though, I hardened against her, against my fear and my anger. She couldn't help me, and I didn't need her. The picture of the chairman on the wall seemed to nod in the flickering light. He alone would protect me on this journey.
Wonderful. I cannot wait until this is out in the world and everyone can enjoy this amazing book. All right. Well, I don't want to hog all the questions. We should probably make some time for audience questions. I think Anissa is going to jump in.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions in the Q&A box, despite me, of course, forgetting to mention that we have a Q&A section, of course, every time. The characters are so vivid. Are they modeled after people you know in real life?
So I think there's no one that's like, oh, Mama Fang is this person or Boss Yeung is this person, but I think they were in fact informed by my reporting or by my sort of understanding of the dynamics. I think, say, Scarlett, for example, I did reporting in China in 2004 and 2008. And I remember going out one night with some of the factory girls, and we were playing some dice game whose rules I never understood, but it involved drinking. I just drank when I was supposed to. But I just saw how in some ways, like, their life was hard. They worked for, routinely 6 days a week. But in some ways they had a freedom unlike anything their parents had ever known. And it was just fascinating to try and kind of understand, like, well, who could this, how did this how would these girls grow up? And having grown up under sort of the one child policy, like how would that inform how they thought about having kids, and what that all meant? And then just even someone like Mama Fang, I just reading about these entrepreneurs in China who make, something out of nothing, like the cardboard box queen of China that you may have heard of, where all the Americans, we were, all the boxes, that good virgin cardboard that was just getting thrown in, but then she shipped it back and then was selling it back to the US. Like it was just, it was just, but yet, and Mama Fang also, there's a much older archetype in Chinese, classic Chinese literature about sort of the matchmaker who sort of like had one hand in everyone's pocket, and being able to sort of add that as a part of her character. That was really fun too.
Thank you. How does fiction writing change / improve your journalism?
So I talked about it a little bit, but I think definitely I have a much stronger sense for narrative. I mean, of course, journalism, you have to report on what happens, and you don't want to sort of hide any flaw or weakness in your reporting by trying to cover up with like pretty writing. But I think it definitely has made me think about character, dialogue. I mean, every craft element I would use in thinking about a short story or in a scene of a novel. Like you can bring that to a column or to a piece of nonfiction as well.
Thank you. And just a shout out to our YouTube friends. If you have questions, we can bring those back as well. I'm going to combine two questions here about experiencing and writing about the Asian story through that lens. And also Scarlett and Daisy come from different upbringings, cultures, and have moments where they clash. Do you have advice on how to resolve such conflicts when one comes from a more traditional Asian upbringing versus one who comes from an Asian American upbringing? And how can we encourage more open, empathetic conversations across the vast Asian community?
That's an amazing question, and something that I think we've been thinking a lot of broadly, just with the Asian, the hate crimes against Asian Americans, but then even sort of questions about our Pacific Islanders being erased or fully represented in things like Asian American Pacific Islander Month. Like, do they, are these categories, are they doing more harm than good? And just like kind of thinking about the different ways in which we can elevate different people's stories. And, but I guess, first of all, I'll just talk about the characters and then sort of like my thoughts about community and sort of like empathy and storytelling. But yeah, I think one of my goals with A River of Stars was, the Chinese community is not a monolith. There's no one way that people immigrate. There's no one way that people, they speak different dialects, their education level, their immigration status, all of that is all over the place. But so often, as with, there's that danger of the single story, or just the fact that when there is a narrative scarcity, that any one story that sort of makes it all the way through takes on greater significance or weight, just because there's so few stories out there. And so one of the things about A River of Stars is just Scarlett and Daisy. You might think they don't necessarily see eye to eye in the beginning. They're both heavily pregnant, and they do have to, in the end, come to rely on each other and sort of form this, found family. And I think just thinking about the community overall, just making sure that that the voices, that those with sort of a platform or privilege do realize that you're like, oh, it's not even just like, oh, I need to be generous and make space. It's like, it's for everyone's benefit, if, you know, this is about, like, how do you make sure that all the voices are being represented fully and strongly, and, you know, what are the ways that we can support and hopefully through that storytelling or through that personal connection begin to change, you know, foster that understanding. And I wrote, as a journalist, I've written about Letters for Black Lives, which was a online campaign where it was directed at community elders about sort of what the movement was all about. And they did it in 2016, and they did an updated version in 2020. And then separately, a story I did for the New York Times has also talked about the ways in which people are trying to have those ongoing conversations. It's not about talking down to anyone, but just sort of making space for that continual conversation. Hopefully, you know, nothing happens overnight, but just knowing that those conversations are possible, painful as they are.
Thank you, and welcome back, Yalitza. You left for just a second.
What happened?
I love this one. Have you thought about doing an SF foodie book / cookbook? You would be great at this.
Actually, it's funny. I don't know if readers of my column may also know that I've gotten, among my pandemic hobbies, I have my sourdough starter, but I also have really gotten into foraging. So I was just on the hunt for some green walnuts. I'm going to make some nicino probably in the next month. I made it for the first time last year. And I do love cooking and eating. So I think all of those things will end up in some shape or form in any book I write, whether or not it's a San Francisco cookbook or food book per se.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's see. I loved your book. Looking forward to your next one. Can you tell me how you make your dialogue work so well?
Thank you. I think they've always said, there's a couple things I always say in workshop, and like dialogue can't just be a transcript. It has to feel like sort of like the most intense or distilled moments, and also it has to feel like, and I've tried to figure out, like, do I totally understand what this means? But dialogue is what you do to people do to each other. So what's at stake, and even if they're having a conversation about not putting the milk away, like what's the underlying power dynamic? And you can sort of figure out that it's not just sort of information that has to be conveyed, but sort of like the subtle, you know, the stuff that's running under the surface, the subtext, like subtext is very powerful, I think, with dialogue.
Sorry, I'm not skipping out. I'm trying to keep up with all of your writing links in the chat. And folks, I am putting all these links. Somebody just mentioned an article about foraging that you wrote about, so I'm putting that in the chat.
While she's looking, I'll show off Baby Yoda.
I'm in love with Jollibee and Keanu.
Yes.
Baby Yoda doubles.
Yeah, Yalitza gifted me this during the pandemic. He showed up. And I will, yeah. Has anyone else thought that The Mandalorian is about like a single dad just trying to make it, but not having enough childcare? Anyway.
That sounds like a universal story.
Exactly.
Let's see, how about, so in the book club last night, we all thought this was really set up for a sequel or an option or another book. We want to know what happens to the babies.
Well, I did get a note. The novel was optioned for a movie, and I got I was recently communicating with this screenwriter, so they still have something in mind. So I'm very curious to see what might come of it. But as for these ladies and their babies, I guess never say never. But I think for me, I feel like I've been on a journey with them. And for now, they are where I'm happy for them to be. I wish them well. I have not thought about where they are right now specifically, though.
All right, we'll accept that, I suppose. Yeah. Okay, one last question, and it's a hard one to choose from, but how about, can you talk about the shift from short stories and deceit and other possibilities to novel writing? How hard was it for you to shift, and what recommendations do you have about structure in that shift?
Great question. And I think Yalitza, I think we've talked about this before, because Yalitza is also a short story writer and a novel writer. And you can check out her amazing short story in Best American Short Stories. What year was it? 2018 or 2019? 2019. 2016. Okay. But I think I've felt that in some ways a short story is closer in form to a poem. Because it's more about a turn or a moment in a person's life, whereas, or a character's life, whereas a novel is sort of like this journey. And I don't think a novel should feel like a really long short story, or like a short story every 20 pages. Like the arc shouldn't feel, I don't know if I'm using the math wrong, I'll just use my hand. Like it shouldn't feel like a ball with like a very consistent arc. It almost has to feel like it's I don't know, racquetball. Like it's sort of like maybe building up toward the roof, but sort of like it's like sort of a little bit back before going forward. And so the movement is different. But I mean, of course, I just remember the first time where I realized that I was writing a novel. It is intimidating. You're like, do I even know how do I get to page 25? And but then just sort of realizing every word counts in both forms, but there's, I don't know, you have time to sort of, there's a different momentum and a different way of settling in. And just, I don't know, I think with both short stories or novels, if you're trying to figure things out, take a book that you love and figure out what happened in the first page, what happened in the first third, by the midpoint, what happened, and sort of backwards engineer it. And I mean, in some ways you are absorbing it through osmosis, that storytelling structure. It's what we've been exposed to all our lives. But taking that time to sort of like, again, reverse outline it or backwards engineer it, whatever you call it, I think can help you make that transition.
Thank you so much. All right, I'm coming back on screen with you all. Thank you so much, Yalitza and Vanessa, always for being such an amazing supporter. And I knew they were gonna have resources, just bam, bam, bam. So I tried to keep up in the chat, but as I mentioned in the beginning, this document is a living document, and all of those links are in there. You can find Vanessa at the library, you can find Yalitza at the library, and we'll be watching for Yalitza and more writing from her as well. And like I said, Vanessa, thank you for being such a supporter of not just the library, but of other writers. We appreciate that so much. And I want to thank you both for being here and giving to you, our library community. I know our library appreciates that. We know, we're not the highest paid place in the world, but we appreciate you being here, and our community double appreciates it. So library, thank you. Library members, library community, we miss you, we love you. We'll see you soon. Vanessa, Yalitza, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.